Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Quincy Institute's webinar on the new book, Faith and Fear by Greg Daddis. My name is Marcus Stanley, and I am the Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute. The Quincy Institute is a transpartisan foreign policy think tank in Washington that is dedicated to creating a more restrained and less militarized American foreign policy. We work toward a new strategy of diplomatic engagement and the defense of our country based on the interests of the American people, not corporate and political interests that have fueled American wars. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Colonel Greg Daddis. Uh, we're going to be discussing, as I said, we're going to be discussing his book. Colonel Daddis is a graduate of West Point and a 26-year veteran of the United States military. He's a veteran of both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and he has won a Bronze Star and Meritorious Service Medal. He also was the chief of the American History Division at the U.S. Military Academy in West Point. And today he is a professor of history at Texas A&M. So welcome, Colonel Daddis.
Thanks so much for having me on, Marcus. Appreciate it.
Yes, so we're going to be discussing your new book, Faith and Fear, which is, I have to say, it is a formidable book, and I would encourage our audience to look into it. It's a 600-page book that explores the full scope of American military and diplomatic history, the history of American foreign wars since the close of World War II. So that is an ambitious endeavor. And I don't think we're going to cover all of it today, but I think we're going to have a great discussion. So I wanted to start out by asking you, you're both a military veteran and a historian, and I don't want to say that's unusual since a lot of the greatest historians since Thucydides have been also had a military background. But I think it is a little unusual for an academic historian today. Uh, how did your experience as a military veteran inform your desire to write such an ambitious book? And do you think you approach the book differently because of your military background?
Yeah, thanks so much, Marcus, and thanks to everyone who's joining us for this conversation this afternoon. I really appreciate it. So, in many ways, I think my military career did have an impact on how I thought about this book. I certainly the last time I served in Iraq in 2009, as American forces were withdrawing from Iraqi cities and ultimately leaving this war-torn nation, it kind of put into perspective for me our relationship with war and what was actually achievable with the use of armed forces overseas. But I think perhaps maybe even more importantly, it was the fact that I was able to intersperse my Army career with academic appointments that allowed me to get my graduate degree and my PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and work with a phenomenal advisor, Dick Cohn, who I think probably taught me more about the profession of arms than just about anybody, either in uniform or out. And as I was leaving Chapel Hill, Dick said that if I stayed in academia, I was heading to teach at West Point, that I should aspire to write a big idea book, as he called it, and that was basically the genesis of this quite some time ago. And that big idea was trying to answer this very big question of what has our relationship with war been like since 1945? And what I tried to do was approach that question less from a systemic concept or a framework, less from an international theory, relations theory framework, and more almost from an emotional standpoint. What has been our emotional impact and relationship with war over the last 80 or so years? And what I found, both being in uniform and kind of being in academia and working with amazing colleagues and dealing with veterans who were writing about their own experiences and historians, was I started to see a trend emerge over time of a fairly dysfunctional relationship between two themes. And the first theme was this faith that we continually placed in war after 1945, a faith that war could be transformative, that it could help us achieve our policy objectives overseas while at the same time keeping us safe. And next to and integrated with that faith was this fear of the unknown and a fear of what the world would bring in this post-World War II era, and a fear of war and its consequences. And both and those fears, both foreign and domestic, were in many ways and oftentimes existential. We kind of pushed these fears to the forefront of our thinking that then reinforced our faith in war. And so, what I wanted to explore over time was this dysfunctional emotional relationship that Americans have had with war since the end of the Second World War, and see how that ebb and flow over time of faith and fear worked to, in a sense, militarize our foreign policy, and in many ways, I think, kind of vault military tools to the forefront of how we thought about foreign policy, grand strategy, and our general approach to the rest of the world.
Thank you. So because your book really is about our emotional relationship to war in many ways, it's to some degree a history of our own propaganda and self-justification around war,
Yeah.
uh, perhaps more than a conventional military or diplomatic history. Um, and I'm curious, in a democracy, we always do have to justify war. We have to rally the public. Um, and but you're someone who has also you've been in the military and in the Pentagon to a degree. To what degree do our actual sort of high level decision makers have this, sort of swallow their own propaganda, swallow this self-justification, have this emotionalized relationship to their wars, or is it just something put out to the public?
No, I think there is a cultural component that kind of integrates into and then reflects military thinking. I mean, certainly, I was brought up on this. Dick Cohen, my advisor, is an expert in civil military relations. So during my graduate degree, I think I was both formally and informally thinking about the consequences of proper civil military relations in, especially in the Cold War era, where we seem to be in a time of war, not war. But what I wanted to do with this book as well was think about the cultural components of this relationship, and less from a standard military history approach and more from a war and society studies approach, where we think about the consequences of how American society decided to go to war, how that society experienced war, and then I think most importantly, how that society dealt with the consequences of war. And there is a cultural component to this that I think drove much of how we thought about war throughout the Cold War era. And so there is a domestic component to this that I don't think we can ignore. If you think about, just as one example, the political opportunism that is inherent in the early Cold War era and the age of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and how those fears of foreign enemies kind of turns inwards and we see enemies within, that very much becomes far more expansive than just military thinking and conceptualizations of grand strategy or military doctrine of the day. It becomes embedded, I think, in American identity. And that kind of sense of fear mongering bred a larger consensus and built in many ways a political solidarity among constituents, especially for those politicians who were being opportunistic and thinking about ways in which they could use this faith and fear relationship to their advantage.
You even in the book talk about this psychosexual dimension to the fear of communism, like the identification of communism with homosexuality, which in the great movie Dr. Strangelove is sort of spoofed. Our precious bodily fluids are going to be contaminated. So there's this like internal dimension. I was really struck by how well your faith and fear framework fit the Cold War specifically with this extraordinary, as you say, internalized fear of communism paired with this faith in the rightness and justice of our own sort of social system. And I really kind of feel like this reached kind of a culmination with the war in Vietnam, uh, where it sort of became very difficult for us to see the issues with the Vietnam War through the screen of our own obsession with communism, the nationalist dimensions or the pragmatic stakes of the war. Um, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the war in Vietnam and these dimensions of the Cold War? And then I have a couple of other thoughts about that war as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think we probably have to go back a little bit earlier to Korea. I think Korea is this moment in time in 1950 where these fears that were conceptualized in the late 1940s become tangible. And in many ways, Korea helps us view local conflicts through a global lens, and we start to think about how local civil wars become a national security prerogative on the global stage for the United States. And in many ways, I think set the stage as the British military historian Max Hastings called the Korean War a dress rehearsal for Vietnam. And in many ways, I think you see that play out in terms of the militarization of Kennan's ideas about containment and American grand strategy. If you think about the militarized language that's used in NSC 68 under the auspices of Paul Nitze, that a lot of what drives us ultimately to Vietnam begins much earlier in the 1950s, and I think in particular with the Civil War in Korea. That said, I think this relationship between faith and fear does hold up in many ways, both for the Kennedy administration, who I think does place a faith in what we might call a militarized modernization theory, where the Kennedy administration places a faith in the military and the U.S. Armed Forces to assist with nation building efforts overseas, whether it's Southeast Asia, that I think is perhaps the most the one that's visible for us, whether it's in Laos or ultimately in Vietnam. Um, but also a fear that if I don't act, if the United States does not act, then those fears of falling dominoes that were articulated during the Eisenhower administration will actually come to bear. Um, and so I think that certainly happens in that relationship. I think you see bear out during the Kennedy administration, and then most certainly I think after Kennedy's assassination, as Lyndon Johnson is struggling with what to do with this um, almost intractable problem in Vietnam. Both faith and fear are pushing him to um, choose war in Vietnam and to choose to escalate beyond what he himself may have even thought was reasonable at the time.
Yes, and when you mentioned Korea, I'm reminded your book quotes MacArthur about the Korean War: either we win here or we lose everywhere,
Right, right.
and that is this totalizing relationship with foreign wars that we see in Vietnam, and we also even see with Ukraine, the Ukraine war currently. It's always this all or nothing approach, which has not generally actually turned out to be true in our wars. So one dimension of the Vietnam War also, or that I think the Vietnam War brings out, is the connection between faith and fear in our military and in our military cause, and the larger faith in our domestic institutions and our government.
Mhm.
Because when we failed in a sort of clear way. And I know there's debate about this within the military, but certainly with the Tet Offensive in 1968, it appeared that we had failed in the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War era and the perception of dishonesty by the government really shook the public's faith
Yeah.
in American government in general. When you look at indexes and surveys of faith in government, they take a nosedive during the Vietnam era, and really they never recover. And that I would say affects our politics to this day.
It
So
does, and I find this to be a really fascinating period. My sense is that Vietnam, the American war in Vietnam, is the first time that the United States is confronted um, almost inescapably with the proposition that there are, in fact, limits to American power overseas. There's no way to turn against that proposition when the state of South Vietnam no longer exists after 1975. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of ebb and flow between faith and fear, we might think about faith being at a high point in the early 1960s, where when you read soldier or veterans memoirs like Ron Kovic or Phil Caputo, who are taking this kind of faith-based approach to American exceptionalism from the 1950s and bringing it with them to Vietnam in the hopes that they, like their fathers, will serve as beacons of democracy overseas and push back the forces of evil and totalitarianism. That as you mentioned, 1968 seems to be this tipping point where that faith is challenged. And in many ways, that's the year when we start to see the breakdown of the Cold War consensus. What I find fascinating as a historian is that um, misplaced faith or the questioning of that faith only lasts for so long. If you think about the Carter administration as just an example, Carter goes into office in 1976, talking about alternatives to a faith-based approach to foreign policy when it comes to war. And despite his best efforts, he leaves office reinforcing that faith in military power that obviously is picked up on in 1980 and even before with Reagan as he's campaigning and seeing war as a way to revitalize the nation and become a true pillar of American power and, if not American character. And so what's fascinating to me is that questioning of faith in the aftermath of Vietnam is only temporary. And very quickly, the nation is on board with Reagan reconceptualizing the Vietnam War as a noble cause and on board with a hyper militarization of the American economy and, in many ways, American foreign policy, if not in practice, at least rhetorically.
yeah, you scooped my next question about the Carter administration and that failed attempt to turn away from militarism, which I think Carter really believed in. And before I continue, I should mention there is the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we're going to turn uh, in about 10 minutes or so to audience questions. Um, but just to continue with the dialogue with Greg for a few more minutes, I there is this whole popular culture dimension around militarism. Maybe this is just when I was born or when I was growing up, but it really uh, there's this, Top Gun and these Rambo and these military movies in the 80s. And I was also very struck. I've been doing some research and work around the Vietnam War lately and looking at veterans' testimonies on it. And they're very traumatized actually because of the way the Vietnam War was fought and the things they felt compelled to do. And it's very moving listening to those testimonies. But then the figure of the Vietnam veteran is often almost turned into a figure of fun in uh, in popular culture. The crazy Vietnam veteran. Um, do you want to? We're
Sure.
not so far from the same age. So you're exposed to this popular culture too. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, one of the last movies I saw before, if not the last movie I saw before entering into West Point in 1985 was the second Rambo movie. And so I'm sure when I saw it at the time, I didn't understand the larger context of what was happening. I was just watching Sylvester Stallone, um, flex his muscles and shoot machine guns from his hip. But I do think the cultural component is important here. If you mentioned earlier what is known as the Lavender Scare in the 1950s, and there is a cultural component to how we think about war-based fear, both foreign from a foreign perspective and domestically. And I think you see that cultural component play out in the 1980s, where it supports almost becomes a propaganda arm for the United States government. And this, as Susan Jeffords called it, a few decades ago, this remasculinization of America through remilitarization. And so when you look at the redemptive revenge narratives of Sylvester Stallone movies or the Chuck Norris missing in action movies, if you look at the faith and technology component that you see in movies like Top Gun, or how every action hero, whether it's Arnold Schwarzenegger or Chuck Norris or Steven Seagal, all have a Vietnam Green Beret resume in their back pocket that is part of the storyline to demonstrate that there is a way to have war be redemptive, not just from a military side of the house where Carter is lambasted by far right conservative organizations like the Committee on Public Danger, which are just lambasting him for letting the armed forces wither away. You think about Operation Eagle Claw and the failed attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran. That Carter is basically blamed for that. And you can see here culturally, as well as from a policy perspective, Reagan leaning into um, using that remilitarization as a way for Americans to feel better about themselves in the aftermath of this defeat in Vietnam.
So we do have a bunch of questions, um, but which I'm going to turn to in just a moment. But I'm also going to ask one or a bunch of questions from the audience, I should say. But I'm just going to ask one more uh, question here to you. Uh, to me, as I said, I think this faith and fear framework really fits like a glove for the Cold War. Because there's this very clear ideological split and this argument that communism is an expansionist ideology. But to me, one of the biggest questions in thinking about the grand sweep of American foreign policy since World War II is why the end of the Cold War and the end of this ideological split doesn't lead to a more dramatic transformation in America's relationship with war. How would you answer that question?
It's really fascinating one, and I thought about it for quite a bit as I wanted to kind of expand just beyond the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the last part of the book is on the 1990s. So I think about this more as the long Cold War, if you will. And in many ways, I think you see the faith and fear paradigm or cognitive framing, if you will, play out during these years where both the Bush 1 administration and the Clinton administration are looking to use war to create a sense of order in what they fear to be a chaotic international environment with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a policy component to that of seeking to expand NATO as a solution to the potential for instability in Eastern Europe. I think there was a cultural component to that of many Americans asking the questions, how do we define ourselves as Americans if we no longer have an existential enemy against which to define ourselves? Um, and I think in many ways you also see, especially in the Clinton administration, as it's looking to engage in this policy of enlargement, military force being wedded to economic development on the global stage, and a faith that American military power can continue to open up and then stabilize markets for us in this post-Cold War era. At the same time, these fears from the Cold War are moving forward into the 1990s, a fear of domestic terrorism that plays out and in many ways parallels some of the fears you saw during the Red Scare era, as well as fears of nuclear proliferation, whether it's North Korea or nuclear weapons getting in the hands of state or non-state sponsored terrorists. And again, there's a cultural component to this. Think of Tom Clancy's The Sum of All Fears, where um, terrorists get a hold of an Eastern European, post-Soviet nuclear weapon and use it on the American homeland. So I do think there are elements of that cognitive framing that play out throughout the 1990s as Americans are searching for how best to navigate this new world order, as Bush calls it, in a way that provides security, but also allows us to deal with new fears that are emerging from um, the aftermath of the Cold War. Is I forget who mentioned this. I think it was one of Madeleine Albright's staffers said, or if it was not herself, saying that, we had slayed the dragon of the Cold War, but what we were most concerned with the thawing of this Cold War landscape, that all these snakes were going to rise up and they were going to actually be more threatening than the specter of Moscow directed communism.
And of course, with 9/11,
Yeah,
it seems like every nightmare
right,
is coming true. And you have Bush's speech at West Point, where he sort of defines we're on the side of good. It's a
right,
cosmic struggle between good and evil,
right.
and the American military is the one going to fight it.
And in many ways, I think that global war on terrorism moment is asking similar questions of the Cold War, and I would argue asking a question that we're still wrestling with today, which is what is our current relationship with war, and what is the purpose of war in the early 21st century? Is it about retribution or prevention of other wars? Is it about economic stability or democracy promotion? I still think we're working through this very fundamental question of what is our relationship with war, and I think you see it playing out right now on within the administration when it comes to both the Middle East and Eastern Europe.
And there's this theatrical dimension to
Yeah,
war, where these strikes on these supposed Venezuelan drug boats. We have this deeply embedded social problem of drug abuse, which really is a crisis in many ways in the U.S. But then there's a desire to militarize it, as though by rocketing these small boats full of
yeah.
God knows who, we're going to solve the problem of American addiction.
Right. And or solve the problem of domestic dissent by, again, like the Cold War, finding enemies within rather than focusing on enemies without. And in many ways, if you look at this summer's recent military parade, it suggests that despite um, an aversion to war, Americans still find war attractive.
Although I have to say, I attended that military parade. I live in DC, and
Mhm.
all I can say is that the United States military is not actually optimized for ceremonial parades
That's right.
in the way that the North Korean or military and other autocratic states are. So I
Which
actually
hopefully is a good thing.
somewhat reassuring, yes. So I'm going to turn to questions now, and we are still have a half hour to go in the discussion, so I think we'll have time for more if people want to add additional questions. There are a number open though. So the first one is a two-parter, uh, and I'll ask them one at a time.
Sure.
First, what was the receptivity of your teaching by budding officers at the service academies? And I realize that was probably earlier in your career, so you might not have arrived at this all yet. But
Not fully, although I was by that point I left. My final year at West Point was 2015 is when I retired from the Army. Um, my hope is that it was received fairly well, and West Point was a place back in 2015, and I very much hope it continues to be, although I do have my concerns today, where the cadets were mature enough to be critical about the use of military force overseas, but also be proud of their profession and be proud of their service to the nation in a way that wasn't just cliche, that they were thinking about and willing to have deep discussions about um, the applicability and also the limits of American military power overseas in a way that I think was healthy. Um, and I think we need, as citizens of this democracy, officers who are willing um, to contest the unthinking belief that military power can solve all our problems. And I don't think that's um, a mode of thinking that undermines national security. In fact, I would argue just the opposite, that restraint, as the Quincy Institute is all about, is is a venue for us to be more specific with how we think about the use of military power and its employment, and also to be more discerning about what the relationship we have, not just at the military academies and within our armed forces, but society at large with war. So I am a little concerned, to be honest with you, right now in terms of how the academies are seemingly somewhat under attack from an anti-intellectual standpoint, and I think we certainly need to guard against that because we need our officers in all of the services to be thoughtful if we're going to have a useful um, and quite frankly, powerful armed forces. We need smart, thoughtful officers. And that's why I think the intellectual component of this is so critical.
Yeah, the military in a way is getting whipsawed because
Yeah,
of pressure to, or claimed pressure to politicize the military under Biden Democrats, but now there may be an even more dangerous politicization coming from the conservative side.
yeah.
Um, so a second question, very different one. Can you speak a little about Kennan and his philosophy of containment, and did he offer an alternative path to on international relations that was less militarized and more diplomatic? And you do address this in your book, and some people actually criticized containment for potentially leading us to foreign wars, but
Right. Yeah. I think, again, for me as a historian, I think this is why the war in Korea is so important because what it does is verify to those who are questioning the non-military aspects of containment. Um, it verifies that there is an actual global threat here, that this is not a local Korean Civil War, that this is something that has been um, guided by Moscow and thus requires a military response. And, what I do with my students is kind of compare either the X article or um, Kennan's original memo on containment with some of the key pieces from NSC 68 and ask them what happened in those intervening years. I mean, and it happens very quickly. Again, if we think about it, um, you know, we're we achieved this global victory in the Second World War in 1945, and by 1947, 48, we're already thinking about the possibility that we're facing um, a violently expansionistic Soviet Union. And for me, I actually use this opportunity with students to ask this vital question of a very confident nation coming out of World War II very quickly believes in its worst fears that it's facing a global totalitarian threat that's bent on world domination. And I talk to my students all the time to look for that phrase world domination in these key documents because it happens over and over and over again. And so I do think that there is a process of militarization. I think Kennan was not think I know Kennan was clearly um, um, unhappy, if not somewhat disgusted by the militarized component of his theories. But Marcus, I think you're right. I think there were critics at the time, Walter Lippmann among them, who were suggesting that containment itself was a policy that was going to push America into unwanted wars because it seemed to be interventionist at its very core.
yes. So going on to the next question, can you comment on the necessity, or I would add the lack of necessity, possibly, of wars for the U.S. economy?
I mean, clearly, I think any conversation about the economy starts with Eisenhower's warnings of a military-industrial complex, which very much, I think, becomes part of the conversation. Um, my sense is, like many political opportunists, especially during the 1950s, when Americans are placing quite a bit of their faith in atomic weaponry and ultimately theories of deterrence that will kind of transform into theories of massive retaliation, that there's quite a bit of money to be made in that transformation. And so there are opportunists from the economic side as much as the political that are seeing this faith and fear dichotomy work out to their advantage. And I think we get to a point where I don't think you can talk about this faith and fear framework without thinking about the domestic economic components of it. And here, I guess I'll put a plug in for QI and Bill Hartung's and Ben Freeman's upcoming work on the $1 trillion war machine, where they talk about um, the deep economic components of our relationship with war. And in many ways, I think, where I'm looking at it from an emotional standpoint, Bill and Ben are looking at it from an economic standpoint that I think fit fairly well to explaining what is this larger relationship we have with war.
Thanks. And I second your plug of Bill and Ben's work.
Yeah.
Um, so I told them, they had this title, The $1 trillion War Machine, and they were gonna I think they were gonna put a question mark after it. And I'm like, no question mark. The US government's gonna outrun you and reach $1 trillion before you can even read
Before the book comes out,
book.
that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Next question. Do you think the use of the question of US national interest on the global stage today increases the relationship between faith and fear, in the sense that the promotion of fear of China, fear of Russia, is greater than the feeling of faith, perhaps in our own system?
I do. And I think, again, I think, I tell my students as a historian that we need to be very careful with historical parallels. But we do see this relationship between globalizing local threats or regional threats into something that impinges upon U.S. national security. And we see that over and over and over again during the Cold War era, whether it's in Latin America, where we're concerned about what many were worried about, Soviet beachheads in the Western Hemisphere. We saw it obviously in the Middle East as we increasingly intervened into local and regional conflicts, again, in large part because of an economic component and access to raw materials. And I think we clearly saw it in both East and Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 1960s, that were kind of pushing the United States into um, these fear-based assessments that were not just assessing threats, but exaggerating threats. And I think we see something similar happening today. I've heard from many peers who are at the war colleges of the armed forces today, whether it's the Naval War College or the Army War College, and not just going through scenarios where there is a possibility of war with China. They're already engaged in scenarios where there will be a war with China. And I think those fear-based um, threat evaluations are not healthy for us, because we're no longer preparing for a possible war. We're preparing for a likely war. And I think what that then does is um, take these fear-based evaluations and move them from a moment in time, from a moment of competition to likely conflict. And again, I'm not so sure that's healthy for us as we're thinking about how best to evaluate threats overseas and how, in fact, they are related to U.S. national security.
I gotta say, it's somewhat scary to hear you describe that level of war planning. Um, the next thing was actually a statement, but I'm going to turn it into a question. Um, and the statement was that Reagan, whatever his rhetoric, did not get us into a foreign war. And I do think that's interesting. I mean, Reagan did practice militarism in South America, and
Right.
there was a war in El Salvador. But it's also true. It is true that Reagan was prepared to understand when Gorbachev reformed the Soviet Union. He understood that opportunity and took hold of it. He did not reject it as
Yeah.
some wanted him to. And even before that, in 1983, I actually made a Twitter a post on Twitter or X with a video clip from one of Reagan's early speeches where he asks for diplomacy with the Soviet Union and arms control negotiations as
Right.
early as 1983. So there is this strain in Reagan. And do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. This is why I love teaching about the Reagan administration because besides the cultural component of this faith-fear relationship, there's such a fascinating political component to this. And what I was surprised when I was doing research on this book is there is this Reagan paradox, as Jay you mentioned, or I'm sorry, the, um, whoever asked the question. I'm sorry, I missed the name. Um, there is this kind of paradox with Reagan, where he's speaking, especially in his first term, about the evil empire and the need to remain strong against what clearly is a global threat. But those fears kind of dissipate, or those fears dissipate because of his own personal and I think far larger fears about nuclear war. I've used in class a really fine book by James Graham Wilson, The Triumph of Improvisation, which argues that Reagan was willing to improvise as the Soviet Union under Gorbachev was making these very rapid changes. But what I was surprised at in my research was how virulently Reagan was attacked from his own party to the right, and that he was painted as someone who was being duped by Gorbachev, that he was giving away the store, that he was being naive, that he didn't understand the continuing threat to the nation. And yet Reagan still stands firm and kind of moves along with George Shultz to engage in dialogue and diplomacy in large part because of these fears of nuclear war that are very present in popular culture. You think about the ABC movie from, I believe it's 1983, The Day After, um, which kind of, from a pop culture standpoint, reinforces these fears in a way and articulates these fears in a way that probably had not been seen since Dr. Strangelove or On the Beach 2 decades earlier. Reagan himself reportedly was kind of taken aback by this depiction of what Lawrence, Kansas, and the Midwest would look like in the aftermath of a nuclear exchange. ABC holds a roundtable panel with George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, and I believe William Buckley is on it. And so clearly this is a moment in time where these fears are being articulated, not just inside the White House, but culturally across America. And so I think in many ways, even if we might disparage Reagan for his first term um, militarization of U.S. foreign policy and the economic choices he's making to reinforce that militarization, I think simultaneously we do have to give him credit for um, listening to clear-headed advisors like Schultz and being willing to work with Gorbachev as Gorbachev himself is trying to deal with an economic and military system that is under strain, if not in real time collapsing during Reagan's second administration.
Yeah, and we still get these kinds of attacks on peacemakers to this day. But one dimension I have to say, you mentioned the nuclear disarmament movement and the attention to
Right.
the impact of, calling it the impact of nuclear war seems like an understatement. Um, but it seems in certain ways we've kind of lost our fear of nuclear conflict. It's actually been kind of amazing uh, the risks people have been willing to run around the Ukraine war and the
Okay.
sort of the lack of popular, apparent lack of popular concern about that. Do you want to, I guess I'm inserting my own question here a little
No,
bit.
but I really do think that that's a fascinating question, Marcus, and one of the reasons why I wanted to take a long view of this. It is a big book, not 600 pages, but bigger book. Um, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to take a longer view of this relationship with war, because you do see this ebb and flow of fear over time, right? That we're willing to potentially take the nation to nuclear war in 1962, and then after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that fear drives much of of how we relate to nuclear weapons for a decade, if not more. And yet, by the time we get to the 1980s, we see again nuclear saber rattling. Um, and so I've been really fascinated as I was, or fat was fascinated as I was doing research for the book about how faith and fear work over time in relation to each other, and why is it in some moments we're incredibly afraid of nuclear Armageddon, and in other times we're not seemingly all that concerned with it. And I think we are in a moment of time, we're in a moment of time right now where um, despite the potential dangers, we're really not having all that much deep conversation about the potential for escalation.
Yeah, and the United States, for those who don't know it, is planning a major buildup of our nuclear arsenal, along with destabilizing measures like a missile shield, and we're doing that at a time when we are dealing not only with Russia but a Chinese buildup of their nuclear arsenal. So I think we should be more afraid. So to move to the next question, what do you see as the proper role of the United Nations and I guess multilateral institutions in providing an alternative to militarization and arms races?
It's a great question. I think it's unfortunately one that Americans don't spend enough time with it because there is a um, there's not a lot of faith, I think, that Americans place in collective security organizations. I think there is a fear here of losing American independence when dealing with collective security institutions like the United Nations. I think what we're also seeing is the United States struggling with this transition to a multipolar world where organizations like the United Nations can be more effective, perhaps even should be more effective. Um, in working through some of these problems as the United States moves from a more unipolar moment that we saw at the end of the Cold War to clearly a more multipolar environment, and one that I'm still not sure, especially with this administration, how they're dealing with it. We see the Secretary of State arguing that we are, in fact, in a multipolar world, and then we see kind of um, a disregard for collective security organizations and multilateral organizations like the United Nations. And I think we're going to have to reconcile that in a way that we can take advantage of the United Nations and use our power and prestige and influence to make it a more effective organization. I'm not so sure it is right now, in large part because in many ways I don't see the United States thinking of the UN as all that effective.
So I'm having difficulty keeping ahead of the flow of questions, and we have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. A couple people are asking about the American relationship to the war in Gaza and potentially the genocide in Gaza, and also to the war in Ukraine. So could you comment on these contemporary issues?
Um, in many ways, I think the faith component still plays out. I think if you and this faith and fear paradigm and framework, I don't think is unique to the United States. I think we saw an immense amount of faith in war when Putin invaded the Ukraine. I think we saw an immense amount of faith placed in war to deal with a long political problem in Gaza under the Netanyahu government. And I think we're seeing that faith in war play out today in both environments, right? Where Netanyahu, with few constraints, especially from the United States, is engaging in, I think, what can only be called an eliminationist policy towards Palestinians in a way that is quite frankly just frightening. I've seen quite a bit of punditry back and forth about whether or not we should use the term genocide, but I don't think you can contest that under the Netanyahu government right now that Israel is engaging in an eliminationist policy. And in part, I think what you're seeing with that eliminationist policy is a faith to finally solve the political problem between Israel and Palestine in a way that I think taken to its logical end or illogical end um, potentially means the the dissolving of a people, right? And so, in many ways, I think that paradigm plays out um, not just for the United States, but for local actors both in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, this discussion of genocide is often legalistic in a
Right.
foolish way, but it can become a distraction. I mean, the Israelis themselves have confirmed that over 10% of the pre-war Palestinian population of Gaza are casualties in that conflict. So that is more than a literal decimation, more than a decimation. And that is, regardless of what you call it, that is very sobering and really, I would say, unconscionable.
Right.
And the and speaking of faith, I would almost say there's a third F, fantasy, which belongs in when you see these. Well, Gaza is going to become like this hotel resort area based on this. I'm just fairly flabbergasted. So uh, I um, I just saw this question. I would have raised it when we were talking about the nuclear issue, but I want to raise it now because I know you address this in your book. Some argue that a strong nuclear deterrent is imperative to manage the rest of the world's nuclear advancement. And how does this fit in? And people often do, foreign relations theorists often do talk about deterrence as a force for peace. So,
I mean, I do think that we can't, and I talked about this in my introduction that even if we're talking about this emotional relationship with war, we can't dismiss the fact that power matters in international relations. If you think about some of the key architects of international relations theory in the late 1940s, Hans Markenthau's The Politics Among Nations is just one example. Power matters, and I think it still does. And so I think uh, power as a deterrent clearly is part of the equation when it comes to international relations and the development of our grand strategy. Um, Having said that, I'm not so sure, at least how we're operating today, whether nuclear deterrence is actually deterring war. And here I see parallels with the 1950s, where the Eisenhower administration is placing quite a bit of faith in nuclear deterrence to um, hopefully avoid what he called general war, and placing far more faith in deterrence and as a way to keep a cap on limited wars, focus on covert action with the CIA, whether it's in Guatemala or Iran, a focus on limited engagements along the global periphery as a way um, to maintain a presence overseas, but also hopefully um, avoid that move, that escalation to general war, which basically was nuclear war. What we found in the 1950s, though, is that despite all this talk about deterrence and emphasis on the Strategic Air Command and an expansion of the military-industrial complex, even as he was bemoaning it, war did not deter war. But the deterrence in war did not deter further war. And I think there is a parallel here that we should kind of think about more deeply as Americans. We place so much of our money and effort into the defense budget, and we're not deterring war. I mean, at some point, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we're close to spending $1 trillion a year on defense? We still don't feel more secure. We still are not seeing nations across the globe willingly wanting to put governors on their own programs when it comes to nuclear capabilities. Why is that? Why is war such unuseful tool for deterring more war.
And in fact, the prevalence of international conflict, the prevalence of wars has been increasing
Yeah.
uh, over the post-Cold War period and accelerating in recent
In
years.
some ways, I think, right? I mean, I think, you know, I'm not a mathematician, but I do know there is, ebbs and flow from a quantitative approach to whether there is more or less violence in the.
I can't remember her name, but there's a professor at Boston University who actually is also affiliated as a non-resident fellow with the Quincy Institute who has tabulated the incidence of war and
Yeah.
has found that acceleration.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm going to kick myself because I'm going to remember her name as soon as
Is,
we.
is it Toft or
Yes, Monica Toft, Monica Toft, and thank you. And a
yeah,
really
Dying by the Swords is a really good book.
yes, a TOFT, Toft, and encourage people to look at that research. So we're coming toward a close. May get one or two more questions here, but one what you just said about our excessive faith in the military, good lead into to this question. What can we increase our faith in so that we have less reliance on the military and war as a solution? Is it diplomacy, foreign aid, other things?
This is, I think, where I'm going to probably be more idealistic and say, yes, I think we have to place more faith in diplomacy. Again, it doesn't, um, I'm not suggesting that power doesn't matter when it comes to international relations. It clearly does. But because of this faith and fear paradigm that has played out over time, I think um, we are too quick to think about military solutions to otherwise inherently political problems. And I think we have to um, test the theory that war can be socially and politically transformative overseas, because the historical record suggests that it hasn't been. And in fact, that the more that we intervene, the more that we exacerbate local problems rather than solve them. And I think we have to push back against what we're seeing over the last 6 to 9 months of the dismantling of the U.S. Department of State. And the only winner in the government efficiency initiative was the Department of Defense. And that potentially says something about our relationship with war and why we don't place more faith in diplomacy. And I think in many ways it is because of the fear component of that dialectic.
And in terms of diplomacy, I think it's not just about personnel or institutions, but there's a certain way in which we've kind of over this period of U.S. primacy and being the sole hyperpower, we've lost the skill of diplomacy in the sense of compromise. In other words, a lot of the time when if you listen carefully, when the U.S. government talks about diplomacy, they mean sending someone over to deliver an ultimatum to
Right,
somebody,
right.
which is very different than, okay, let's find a point in the middle where we'll accommodate some of your interests and some of ours. So I really do think we need to exercise that muscle.
Yeah.
So I'll sneak in one more question here, and this will have to be our last. What do you think of the idea of establishing a U.S. Academy for Peace to balance the U.S. military academies?
I have not done any reading for that, but that sounds intriguing. I relied quite heavily when I was doing research on the book on Petra Goda's The Politics of Peace, which talks about some of the alternatives that were popping up throughout the 1950s and 1960s that kind of looks at the Cold War phenomenon through less of a lens of military involvement and more through peace initiatives. Um, and it's a compelling book about potential missed opportunities, and I think something like this would certainly be worth exploring without a doubt.
Okay, so we've come to the close of our hour, and thank you so much for your participation and for
Yeah,
your
thanks,
work
Marcus.
and your research. We actually had several people in the questions thanking you for your work and your scholarship. I'd like to do that too, and thank you for our to our audience for great participation and lots of interesting questions.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.